You know we love to get curious about all sorts of things. And today we're going to explore unisex names, those names that work whether you're a boy or a girl. We'll be diving into how we choose names and what those choices might reveal about us and our culture. Like what makes us lean towards a certain name. And if it even matters, you know. Some names are so perfectly balanced between male and female, it's almost unbelievable. Like, take Bless and Camden, for example. They're practically a 50-50 split. I'm curious, have you ever met anyone with these names? What was your initial impression? Like, did you automatically assume they were male or female?
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public outlets unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Watch them all drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
It turns out, even when we think we're breaking free from those traditional gender norms,
Yeah,
things aren't as simple as they appear.
right.
We're going to take a deep dive into an analysis
Okay.
of how gendered those supposedly unisex names actually are.
The really intriguing part is even names we think of as neutral often lean really heavily one way or the other.
Okay, so how did this analysis actually measure this gender gap?
Well, they looked at how far off a name was from a perfect 50-50 split between boys and girls. So they examined the percentage difference between male and female usage to sort of determine this gender gap.
Going into this, I would guess those gaps would be pretty small, especially for names that we typically consider unisex.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But the data tells a different story.
Right.
There are some surprisingly balanced names,
Okay.
like Bless and Camden,
Bless and Camden.
which are almost perfectly split down the middle.
It's so fascinating because it makes you wonder, why are they so balanced?
Yeah.
Is it because these names are relatively new, or are parents specifically choosing them because they want a more neutral name?
Right.
Or is there something else going on?
It's definitely a question worth exploring.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, we see names like Oluwase and Rivers
Okay.
with a much larger gender gap, leaning heavily male.
See, now those names to me sounded pretty gender neutral at first glance.
Yeah,
But I'm already starting to see how my own perception can be skewed.
exactly. And that's precisely what this analysis is highlighting.
Yeah.
That we make assumptions based on the sound of a name or maybe our limited exposure to it.
Uh-huh.
And then the data reveals these unexpected trends.
Okay.
So it makes you think, are there cultural backgrounds or professions or even a perceived strength of the sound
Right.
that contribute to these associations that we make?
That reminds me of how certain sounds or spellings have become associated with genders, even when we're talking about names.
Yeah.
Like how Aldine and Peyton lean heavily female
Mm.
in the data. Is it the softer sound?
Right.
Or are we witnessing a shift where traditionally male names are becoming feminized over time? I feel like I've definitely noticed that in my own life.
It's a fascinating trend. History is full of names that have crossed these gender lines.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember this analysis isn't about judging anyone's individual choices.
Right.
It's about revealing those subconscious forces that influence how we perceive names.
Okay.
And really, by extension, how we perceive people.
I recently had this experience where I met someone with a name that I just assumed was male.
Uh-huh.
And then I was completely surprised when I learned they identified as female.
Mm.
It made me realize how quick I am to just make assumptions based on a name,
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's amazing how something as simple as a name,
Hmm.
can carry so much weight in terms of our perceptions.
Yeah.
This whole conversation is making me think about how deeply ingrained all of these associations really are.
It is remarkable, isn't it? Yeah.
Even when we aim for neutrality,
Right.
we see these subtle biases sort of reflected in naming trends.
Yeah.
The analysis even included a histogram visualizing the distribution of these gender gaps.
Okay.
It's pretty striking to look
I'd
at.
love to hear more about it.
You could see how even with a handful of truly neutral names, the vast majority lean one way or the other.
Okay.
It visually reinforces the idea that, we're seeing a gradual cultural shift, but not a complete transformation of these perceptions that we have.
Right. So we're still in the midst of this evolution then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that our brains are wired to seek patterns and categorize information.
Yeah.
So that's a natural process for us.
Right.
But recognizing these subconscious biases allows us to challenge them and ultimately move toward a more equitable understanding of names and identities.
Okay, so this is all making sense to me, but I'm curious about the more practical implications of this.
So it's one thing to know that Olowasai is more common for boys, but how does that actually impact our lives and interactions?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Think about it this way. If we subconsciously associate certain names with certain genders,
Yeah.
could that influence our expectations of those individuals? And could it potentially impact things like job opportunities,
Oh, wow.
social interactions, or even how we perceive someone's personality
Right.
before we've even met them?
That raises some really interesting questions about the unintended consequences of these subtle biases, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's not just about names.
Right.
It's about understanding how these seemingly small things reflect and perpetuate these broader societal patterns.
It makes you wonder if we should be more conscious of our own biases when we encounter a new name.
Yeah, precisely. The first step is acknowledging that these biases exist,
Right.
both within ourselves and within our culture.
Yeah.
And from there, we can start to challenge those assumptions and be more mindful in our interactions.
So it's less about controlling how people name their children and more about becoming aware of our own reactions
Yeah.
and potential judgments that we're making.
Right.
If we meet a Peyton and immediately assume they're female, maybe we should pause and consider if we're letting stereotypes influence our thinking.
That's a great example by consistently challenging those initial assumptions.
Okay.
We chip away at those ingrained biases.
Yeah.
It's about fostering a sense of mindful curiosity and approaching individuals with openness, recognizing them for who they are rather than filtering them through our preconceived notions.
I love that instead of getting hung up on what a name should mean, we can prioritize getting to know the person behind the name.
Yeah.
It's about appreciating that unique story that each person brings,
Absolutely.
regardless of their name.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's where true progress lies.
Yeah.
Recognizing the beautiful complexity of identity and understanding that each person has a unique story to tell. This analysis focused primarily on Western culture, which leads me to wonder,
If these trends hold true across different cultures, are there names in other parts of the world that completely defy these gender associations?
that's a fantastic point. This analysis had a limited scope.
Yeah.
It would be so interesting to see how these patterns play out in different cultural contexts.
Right.
How do naming conventions and gender associations differ across languages and cultures? What names are considered unisex in other parts of the world, and do they face similar biases, or are there entirely different trends at play?
Maybe there's a name in Japan that sounds incredibly feminine to us, but is considered totally gender neutral there.
It's definitely possible. And
Yeah.
that just reinforces the importance of recognizing our own cultural lens and being open to, the incredible diversity of naming practices around the world.
But clearly this analysis is just a starting point.
Yeah.
It opens up so many questions about the interplay between names and gender and cultural diversity.
Absolutely. And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. They spark more questions than answers,
Yeah.
inspiring us to continue learning and expanding our understanding of the world around us.
So to wrap things up, it seems like the biggest takeaway here is that unisex is way more complex than we might initially think.
Exactly. And perhaps even more importantly, it serves as a reminder that even these seemingly simple things like names can reveal so much about our culture and our biases and the evolving nature of gender identity.
So true. And as always, we want to hear from you. Have you observed any names that buck the trend? Are there names in your culture that defy these gender norms? Share your thoughts, your observations, your personal stories. We're all ears. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive. Until next time, keep those brains curious and those conversations flowing.